Hello, hello, everyone. How are you, Trisha?
I'm well. How are you, Andrea?
I'm good, thanks.
Yay. Welcome, folks. Excited.
Yeah, excited to have you here.
Yeah.
We're just going to wait a few minutes for folks to join. We'll get started right at 1:02. Folks, if you are just logging in, feel free to open up the chat and drop in where you are joining us from. Always curious to see where folks are calling in from.
Yes, I'm currently based in Toronto, Ontario, where the weather is glum and cold. It was shockingly cold, but hopefully this will bring some sunshine. This conversation will bring some sunshine today.
Yeah, I kept joking with my family that since we changed our snow tires on Sunday, that's what obviously brought the snow on Monday. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what did it.
Exactly. Okay. Folks, chat, I'm finding out it says chat is disabled. Just bear with us here. We have both the chat and the Q&A function. So it looks like chat is disabled right now. That may be actually some of the team members behind the scenes, just making sure that we're asking questions in the right prompt. But so far, one person has said they're joining in from Vancouver, another from Toronto as well. Not sure if the chat will actually be enabled here, but the good news is that folks are using the Q&A perfectly, just the way we want to.
Perfect.
Okay, so Edmonton, Vancouver, Calgary, Winnipeg, Toronto. There we go. Okay, the chat looks like it's up and running. And again, folks, some are using the chat, some are using Q&A. Love to see use of both. And I will talk a little bit about some housekeeping before we actually get started. Wow. Are you seeing this as well, Trisha?
Loving it. Love the engagement. Yeah. Keep it coming.
Yeah. Coast to coast across Canada. Love it. Well, I won't delay any more here on getting started. Again, we like to make sure that folks have an opportunity to get logged in, get settled. But with that, just want to say hello, welcome. Thanks so much, everybody, for sharing where you're joining from. Before I introduce Trisha and acknowledge some of the team members, I want to make sure that we also do the important role of a land acknowledgement. So while I am joining remotely, as is Trisha, as are most of you on the call, it is an important part to acknowledge the land that we are occupying. So as we seek reconciliation and a new relationship with Canada's First Peoples, one based on honor and respect, we acknowledge their oppression and struggles for justice, and that we gather on the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Wendat peoples, and most recently, the territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work in the community and on these traditional lands. I and we are not here simply to utter names and move on, but we are here to recognize our point. We are here to recognize our point of departure, and we start by honoring our hosts, the struggles that they have endured and continue to endure to this day, and everything that we have been privileged with on their account. So that is a very important part of all of our webinars here at Humi. And so in addition to the land acknowledgement, I would like to also acknowledge the folks who have made today's webinar possible. So of course we have Trisha, who will be giving us a brief introduction. Folks, my name is Andrea Bartlett and I am Humi's VP of People. And I would also like to make sure that we do a special shout out for the folks at Bright+Early who have supported Trisha in building what is sure to be a very engaging conversation today, as well as the Humi's content marketing team who's working behind the scenes, monitoring the chat, answering some of the questions in the Q&A. And before I pass it off to you, Trisha, just want to do a quick rundown of why we're actually all here today on a Wednesday for those of us in Eastern Standard Time afternoon. So we're here to talk about compensation and salary band planning. We know that this can be daunting. We're lucky to have the opportunity to really learn from experts like Trisha. I will do my best to add some color and some different experiences of the journey that we've had here at Humi as well. And so we're all here to learn together, and really excited for what this webinar has in store. And as a reminder, this is recorded. So for those of you who have registered, you will be sent a link of the recording, which will go live after the webinar. And the last thing before I pass it over to you, Trisha, folks, please use the Q&A function. I think we got very familiar with it unintentionally really early on there. So please use the Q&A function to ask some of your questions. That's what we will be monitoring throughout the webinar. And we will save time at the end to ask some of those questions that are all at the top of everyone's mind here today. And so with that, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to pass it over to you, Trisha, to introduce yourself and kick us off.
Lovely. Thanks so much, Andrea. So as mentioned, my name is Trisha Neogi. I'm a senior consultant and compensation lead at Bright+Early. I've been with the team for over 3 years now, and I have really come to love compensation. And I say that intentionally because I did not specialize in compensation. I truthfully fell into it, and I love it because it's such a juicy problem to solve. There are so many moving pieces. The market seems to have no logic to it. And personally, that's why I love it. But as Andrea mentioned, it could get super daunting. It's ambiguous. It's confusing. It seems like no one knows what's going on. And some of it, it's true. If someone told me that they had their compensation down to a perfect science, there were no snags, they can predict the market, I would ask them how their wizardry came to happen, and I would love to borrow some of their magic.
I'd be jealous.
I know. Yeah, that would be great. Please give me some magic. But the thing is, compensation is both an art and a science. So there are elements that need to be grounded in data, whereas other aspects you can get creative with. So the goal for today is to really help you build your business case and share some elements around building your salary bands that you can take away immediately after if you wanted to. And I won't sugarcoat it. Building salary bands and implementing them in your organization does take time, and you'll need to iterate it as your business evolves, as your market evolves, and you do need complete buy-in from your leadership team. It's not something that's just one done and dusted. It's something that you need to kind of keep iterating and looking at, but I do promise you, the Trisha guarantee is that once you have a strong foundation built, it does get a lot easier and it does get manageable. So to get into it, we do have a poll coming up in our next slide, which you will be able to access through the Zoom app or the desktop app. So Will, would you like to kick us off? Alrighty, so you will see here a selection of where you are in your salary band journey, and you can choose a single point. So first is we have them, we use a formula. I'm here to validate our approach. 10 out of 10, that's great. The second point is we have salary bands. They don't work for our team. I'm here to get more insight into updating them. Also 10 out of 10. Great. The third point, we don't have them. We need them. I want to learn how to get started in creating them. Great. And then the last point, we don't have them. I don't think we need them. I'm here to learn why they are useful. All of this is you are in the right place if you choose either one of these options. So that is great. All right, we'll give folks a few moments to fill out their responses. Should have like background music.
Yeah, it's hard to have banter when folks are trying to read. And a call out, one of the attendees has asked if we can full screen present. We have tried. We went through a little bit of a tech check earlier, and this is what's working right now with Zoom. It's one of those funny little glitches that we have had, but hopefully folks are able to see. And if they need to zoom in, one of our panelists has mentioned that you can zoom in on your screen as well. Okay, another 30 seconds to answer the salary band journey.
Great. I'm excited to see the responses. This is fun.
Okay, Will, let's wrap it up and share the results. Da, 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 da. There we go.
Okay, very cool. So we have a few folks that have them. They use a formula and they're here to validate their approach. We have a few that have salary bands, but they don't work for their team. The majority of folks here today is that they don't have them, but that they acknowledge that they need them. So definitely, we're going to talk a lot about how to create them today, especially how to build your business case, as well as making sure that the tips and tricks are tangible and feasible. And we do have a few folks around learning that are here today to learn why they need salary bands and why they're useful. So all exciting things, all points that we're going to touch on in today's presentation. So that's great.
Let's jump in.
All righty. So to answer the first question, why even have salary bands? Well, first and foremost, they standardize your pay structure and help you get strategic about where your people are in relation to their salary bands. So, for example, one way you can utilize this is if an individual is in their learning phase, maybe someone new or someone junior to the role or someone completely fresh, they might be towards the start of the brand versus an individual that might be in the mastering stage, so have already gained a lot of expertise and skills, or they have mastered that role, they're maybe towards the top end of the band. So you can make really logical decisions around where you're placing people based on their skills, their experience, their backgrounds. Now, the second point is they support you in making those fair and equitable adjustments by allowing you to make changes across the board versus just doing those one-offs. So gone are the days where you're kind of haphazardly searching and researching any kind of salary data that you can find to either bring in new hires or even bump people up when they ask for a raise. So you can get a lot more proactive about making adjustments versus waiting till an employee basically asks or is even threatening to resign because they haven't received an increase. And with salary bands, you'll be able to see where people are and the cost of adjustments at a macro level. So there definitely is a financial case for it. The third point is that they're all tied to growth because they can connect directly to your career paths. And the best part is that if you don't have career paths in place now, or it is something that you want to design, compensation is a great way to start. We're going to talk about this a bit later, but you can start actually standardizing your levels and the definitions per level in your org. You can start all of that work in compensation, and that beautifully leads into a career pathing project. So it all kind of ties together, even if you don't have everything right away. Kind of touched on this a bit before, but it is critical for financial planning because you'll be able to forecast increases and adjustments. You might be thinking, Trish, I couldn't have predicted inflation. How are you able to forecast that? And the thing is, the answer is you couldn't. It's true. But there are some general rules and guidelines in terms of aging your bands and forecasting it in a way that you leave yourself some wiggle room if you do salary adjustments. So for example, some companies may actually leave 4% annually for market-based adjustments. And as we know, last year, inflation was much higher than 4%, but because the company actually budgeted for that, they were able to afford that and roll that out to their teams versus companies that didn't do that and kind of had to reactively figure out how to actually do market-based increases that were, of course, well justified because the market. And then lastly, they are necessary in providing a rationale to your team, especially if you have a goal around pay transparency. This is starting to actually be a compliance piece too. So we're seeing this in the US, especially New York, where they actually launched a law around pay transparency and job boards. And we're also starting to see this in Canada. So BC and PEI have launched legislation around publicly using salary bands. So it's coming. So it's best to get proactive about this versus waiting until the compliance hits in Ontario. If you are based in Ontario or across Canada, it sounds like folks are all over Canada. So depending on where you are, this is probably already happening, or it could happen in the future. So this is a great way to get ahead of pay equity. And when it comes to reviewing client compensation structures, I typically see companies pay candidates based on what they've asked for rather than a corresponding level or range. And what that means is that when we go and do our compensation work, people are kind of all over the place. Some companies who are thinking about pay equity bring internal employees up when they hire a new person so that they're kind of leveling people out. This is great because when we do our compensation work, it's less to kind of fix. But the thing is, it's still not a strategic way to do it. It's still not methodological. So the process makes sense if you have one person in your department, but the moment you have another person, you should consider building out salary bands so that you're not only connecting to pay equity, but you're also getting strategic about where you're putting people in relation to their salary bands, in relation to their skills and expertise, and however else you decide to pay. And of course, there's a lot of nuances to this. So let's say you're a flat organization, right? And you don't want to assign levels or hierarchy, or you're actually not scaling or growing. You're staying the same for a little bit, and that's okay too. So as part of our work, we kind of deal with these nuances, but regardless of wherever you come from, salary bands still apply to you because you can still move people through these bands themselves without needing hierarchy necessarily, or building a band that's meant for super hyper growth companies. So it still applies. Andrea, when did Humi get salary bands, and how has that evolved over time?
It's a great question. When Humi was really focused on scaling some of its teams, beyond that 10 to 15 person mark, I would say not across the business, but specific departments. That, of course, is where you start to see folks really asking for that career progression, understanding, what's expected of me to go from here to take on more responsibility to get to there. And so I would say across the organization, 2021 was also the wonderful time, as many folks on the call probably remember, when market adjustments really shifted for a number of different reasons. And so really for us, it was fairly early stages of our organization. We had some departments that were more sophisticated than others, but company-wide, our lens was really 2021. And at Humi, we have our annual performance reviews, but a semi-annual compensation benchmarking process because of, market conditions, being a venture-backed business and understanding how that connects to our total compensation philosophy. And so, like you said, it is an art and a science. And there's a lot of different variables depending on the type of organization everybody on the call might be joining from, because industries, stage of business, that all very much impacts the way that you design them, as you know.
Yeah, no, and you hit on some really great points around it connecting to the other pieces of your people processes. Like, for example, career growth. You might already hear feedback around people being like, I want career growth. Where are my salary bands? And you might think, how are those even connected? But the thing is, they're intrinsically connected, because as people develop in their skills and experience, naturally, they're going to be like, okay, I should be compensated for that. And it's true, they should be. So once again, getting proactive and ahead of these conversations, not only build trust as a people team and as an organization, but also it helps inform and educate your team. So great to hear that Humi did that. And, y'all sound like you have the right pieces in place, which is great.
Mm-hmm. Trisha, one question, if I can, that actually has come up is around what folks might do when they feel that they need to adjust salary bands down. And is it fair? You talked about bringing people into bands, but is it fair for existing employees to be more highly compensated than new employees? You kind of touched on this, but I want to make sure that's not lost.
That's a really great question. So what I heard from your first part of the question is, can you bring the bands down? I would say it's a lot easier to roll something out than taking away. And when it comes to compensation, unfortunately, you're getting really into compliance territory. So it actually might become a legal issue. For example, constructive dismissal, depending on how much a salary is being adjusted, if it's considered a demotion. So that is kind of entering legal territory. But when it comes to potentially compensating somebody more than somebody else, that becomes pay equity. So depending on the role, the skill, perhaps tenure, if you're evaluating that, whatever kind of metrics that are under your pay equity. If someone is doing the exact same job, has the same kind of background, skills, tenure, things like that, they should technically be at the same compensation or comparable. If there are discrepancies, you need to be able to actually point out why there are discrepancies. So I often see scenarios where we build out salary bands and we have to do something called redlining, which means that there are people above the band. And the thing is, we can't bring them under. We can't demote their salaries. We can't take away their salaries. So what we do is that we consider them redlined, meaning that they're essentially frozen until they either get promoted, they enhance their skills and experience and move up to the next level, there's another role for them, or they're essentially redlined until there's another market adjustment and, they can probably move into their next salary band or their existing one. But that's kind of it. Like, you can't really give them an increase until something happens in the market or they enhance in their role.
Beautiful. Thank you. And again, that's why having salary bands is so important, but also not something to be taken lightly. Thank you, Trisha.
Of course. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Alrighty. So probably the reason why you're all here. How do you get started? So fair warning, this is going to be a pretty content heavy slide. I'm going to try to get as specific and tactical as possible. But if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and we'll get to them in the Q&A section. So in terms of how to get started, first and foremost, building salaries is a significant undertaking. And without the support from your leaders, your bands will get used. So all of your hard work will essentially go to waste, and we don't want that. So for us, people often reach out to us because they either have already gotten their business case approved and they need external help, which is why they call a consultant, or they actually want help to build their business case and they reach out to us to gain information to kind of help their case. So we've seen both sides of it. And in terms of where to get started, say you haven't gone buy-in yet and you've joined this webinar because you want to actually build your business case, I'd start breaking down your teams based on department and then looking at your salaries in relation to seniority and then flagging those salaries that seem to be over, under, or haven't been adjusted in over a year, and then determine how many individuals are actually impacted by this. So once you have an idea per department, essentially of who's over, under, or haven't been adjusted in over a year, you can look at that high level and calculate the total cost of labor in your organization, and then also calculate the total cost of if those people turned over and if you needed to hire replacements. I know those are quite large calculations, but that in itself is essentially the business case of why you want to get strategic about compensation. What is the loss to the business if all of these people essentially up and left because they weren't satisfied with their compensation or that they weren't getting the information that they needed from you in terms of their compensation? And if that isn't business case enough, there is a compliance factor to it. So in Ontario, if you are a company with over 10 employees, you do have to legally comply with pay equity. And salary bands are a really, really fantastic way to get started with pay equity. So not only a case in terms of strategy and financial planning and of course equity, but also a compliance matter too. And say you've presented this case and it's all good. And after all of that, you might get feedback from your leaders saying that, oh, the market is changing rapidly and the salary bands won't help us remain competitive. We've seen that in the last few years. We had to blow up our bands multiple times. And there might be people in this call that are experiencing this right now. My response to this, and by the way, I will mention I've gotten this from every single client. My response to this is that the bands actually help you remain competitive, but kind of going back to what I said at the beginning, it's not a one done and dusted scenario. You have to keep looking at your bands and iterating. So the market changes, you need to iterate. Your business changes, you need to iterate. So the bands are like, I say your bands are living, just like your policies are living and your philosophies are living, your bands are living, and they need to be adjusted to reflect the dynamics that are happening today. So if they reflect the dynamics, then yes, they will help you keep competitive. And nothing is better than being sound about your strategy. I will say from a candidate perspective, candidates will understand if you can't pay top dollar, but if you have a really sound philosophy about the benefits you're offering, the values you have, your work-life balance, all the other elements that you have as part of your total compensation package, that is actually more lucrative or motivating to candidates than just the base salary. So speaking of philosophy, yeah, this is important. This is something that needs to be done in collaboration with your key decision makers and should encompass your approach to pay. So means where you are in the market, where you want to be, the behaviors you want to incentivize and how you'll do that, how you're paying, so what's actually in your package, and what information you're sharing. So how transparent are you being about compensation? There are so many templates out there. There are so many great guides around how to actually build your philosophy. At Bright and Early, we've actually created a guide to this as well as a sample philosophy. And you can find that in our guide to paying people in our early magazine. We'll send you a link after this webinar, but you can copy and paste that philosophy and kind of edit it to your business needs. But we will say copying a template isn't enough. You need to make sure, once again, that your leaders are bought in, because a lot of these decisions have to be intentional. For example, do you believe in market increases that are happening annually? Do you believe in cost of living adjustments, or are you paying just for performance? There are specific behaviors you're going to incentivize, and specific people on your team that are going to leave if things are done a certain way. So you want to get really, really intentional about what you're saying in your philosophy and what you're not saying. So once you get philosophical, then you can build your criteria in your levels across the org. So this is all happening before you get into the actual market review, by the way. This is all preemptive. And I suggest outlining your levels within your organization and standardizing those definitions. So what I mean by that is look at your org structure and look at, okay, how many actual levels do I have in my organization? If I'm a completely flat structure, what are the different decision-making powers that I have on the team? Someone needs to decide something so you can still kind of point out owners. But say you have a more traditional hierarchy, what do those stages look like? So for example, you could have 6 levels from coordinator all the way up to C-suite. Standardizing these responsibilities are really critical because it's actually going to help you job match and job evaluate later on when you do your actual market review, but it also beautifully ties into career pathing. Say you've already done it, great. It could connect directly to that, but say you haven't started that, but it is something you have to work on. This is where you can start kind of creating career pathing material and start giving your team information they want about their career growth and clear expectations without creating full-blown career paths. So that's a piece where you can kind of work on something before starting the entire project. And what I mean about getting consistent is, for example, let's say a level 2 operations person, they need to have the same expectations as a level 2 engineer. Of course, the job responsibilities are going to be different. Of course, the skills are different, but at the end of the day, at a level 2, what is your expectation? For example, your expectation could be at a level 2, you expect all of your people to be operating with no oversight, and that needs to be standardized across the org. Okay, moving on to point number 4, to build out your salary bands, you want to gather reputable and reliable data. The biggest question I get always is, I cannot pay for a paid database. I don't have the I don't have the investment to make that. I didn't get buy-in from my leadership. The reality is that the free online databases, although a great way to build awareness, it's not reputable or reliable because you can't pinpoint the source, the industry, the age, or the data count. We recommend purchasing a paid source just because it ensures that you're actually getting your data reliable and you can back it up. But say you're not in a position to get a database now, at Bright+Early, our compensation work includes market research. So we look at 2 separate databases, but also there are other options. So say you're venture-backed, for example, Option Impact actually gives you their platform for free if you fill out a pretty extensive, I guess, form, but you get the entire database for free if you have the capacity to do that. And it's something I recommend to my clients as well, if they are not able to actually purchase a database after even working with us. So there are options. And I do think it is worth noting that even if you've invested in a paid database, it's still not 100%, unfortunately, because the market fluctuates, things change. We really saw this especially happen the last 3 years of market going everywhere, and databases weren't able to keep up. And to this, I say this is where it's really important to work in collaboration with your talent team. Your talent team is getting live data happening right now. And it's not to say candidates are giving the right information all the time, but neither are your databases. So you got to kind of work together and decide on an action plan. So for example, let's say your recruiter comes to you and tells you that 50% of chosen candidates are actually asking for the top end of the band. And this is assuming you haven't shared your bands out publicly. So this means that candidates are asking for the top end of the band without even knowing what your range is. To me, that indicates that, okay, either my bands are too low, or we're actually looking for someone more senior than what the job is posted for. And that's where you can kind of go back, evaluate whether it's your bands or, you know, the type of person you're looking for.
And Trisha, I just wanted to call out one thing. We had a question. It is Option Impact that is a free resource that folks can look up. Again, Option Impact.
Yeah.
And I would also add that if you don't have an in-house talent team, or you have partnered with other hiring agencies in the past, sometimes those agencies may have salary benchmark reports. Again, keeping in mind that those reports are only going to be reflective of the roles that the agency has filled in different industries in different locations across usually specific geographic regions. So I know that that's another free source sometimes that folks will benchmark with.
Yeah.
And you mentioned investors at Humi. Sometimes I have gone to some of our investors who have a portfolio of businesses to ask them for benchmarking data for executive level positions, for example, sometimes for niche roles as well, if again, you are not able or in a position where you can purchase that compensation data. But I love that you called that out. That's really helpful because getting the reputable data is usually a challenge, again, depending on the company stage.
Yeah, and I want to say, like, I see y'all, I hear y'all, especially if you are an HR manager or even a coordinator that is tasked with this massive responsibility of building out bands. And sometimes you're not going to have the resources to do it. So I think it's worthwhile mentioning that option impact is specific to early stage private companies, which is why a lot of VCs will work with them. And that's why they usually give the platform for free if you're a tech company. But depending on your industry, there might be other resources. So let's say you're in not-for-profit, Charity Village also has access to reporting too. So it just depends on which industry you're in. But if you're in tech, early stage, option impact is a really great resource to help inform your data. Alrighty. Okay, so now you have your data. Great. Before getting into your salary bands, you can actually determine your market rate. So this is where I kind of go back to my compensation philosophy and see, okay, I've said that I wanted to pay top of market. Can I actually afford that looking at the data? This is where you can validate your compensation philosophy and make any changes before it gets rolled out to your team. I've had a lot of clients that had the best of intentions and said, we want to pay top dollar, top market, and also provide the best benefits because we believe in that. We want our teams to be well taken care of. And then they see the market data and they say, actually, we can't afford this. This is not sustainable. We have to pay at 50th percentile, also known as market average. And that's okay too. The thing is, it wasn't rolled out to the team, so they didn't have to claw anything back. It was more that they iterated and reevaluated once they saw the data on hand. So this is where it comes back to your philosophy and your approach is a living thing. You have to iterate it as you get more information. Okay, now you can build your formula. You have all of the foundation set, and yes, there are a few steps before you can actually get to the salary bands themselves, but these steps are worth it because it means that you're setting in the right intention in place to build out really sound, strategic, and clear salary bands. And when it comes to your salary bands themselves at Bright+Early, when you work with us, we of course give a formula in terms of building out your bands, and our approach is making sure you understand the formulas. So we want to make sure you can grow and maintain it without us after the project ends. But in terms of finding your own formulas or building that out, there's actually a lot of really great resources out there just sharing what some best practices about formulas. So for example, Forbes has a really great article. Also, Barley has some really great material around building out salary bands that is open source as well. And they've included formulas as well. So you can literally Google that. We can send it as a resource after this webinar, and you can actually use that as your first guideline in getting your formula set. So it's great that there's actually so many resources out there to actually help you get started. And once you have your formula in place, this is where you can actually place your people in them. Now, if this is your first time doing this for your team, this is where it could get potentially messy. You might be asking, how do I actually place my people in these bands that I've just created? How does this connect to performance or career path? How can I do it equitably? Is there a formula? And all of those questions are completely valid because this is where it starts connecting to all of your different systems. If your philosophy is that you pay based on performance, you're going to want to integrate performance into your salary bands. And if your philosophy is that you pay per progression, it's going to tie into your career paths. But if your philosophy is that, nope, we don't pay based on any of that, we actually just pay based on market, the placement of your salary bands are going to look different. So it is nuanced and it is specific to what you believe in, what your philosophy is as an organization. But I'm not going to leave you without a formula. So in terms of placing people in your bands, there is something called a compa ratio. And we're going to actually show you in the next slide what that looks like. But Andrea, before I get into that, is there anything you wanted to add or mention around that? Any experiences with Humi?
I think that, again, understanding your compensation philosophy and the nuances, this is something that we had a lot of different conversations with department leaders around that. You know, when you've created the compensation bands, making sure that folks understand what the compensation philosophy is before they're going through changes, educating not only the leadership team who you have really worked with throughout this process to get buy-in, but it's about making sure that that level of communication is shared with the people managers across your organization, because in our experience with Humi, that's where things can really start to break down. Again, understanding your total compensation philosophy, understanding your total compensation package. Outside, of course, we're talking about predominantly base salary, but the other perks, benefits that your organization provides, it definitely does not hurt to take it to that extra step and make sure that you have a bit of a communication plan and education for folks who may be early in the stages of their career talking about compensation. That would be the one thing. We're talking obviously about, doing the analysis, understanding how to build all of these pieces. But that is an important step here when we're actually going through to connect all of these dots together. But I'm very excited for folks to see the compa ratio, because not everybody I think is familiar with what this looks like, and a visual, again, worth 1,000 words.
Yeah, thanks for that. Awesome. So before getting into a compa ratio, it's worth defining it. So this ratio is a formula that is used to compare an employee's base to the midpoint of either their band, if you've created one, or the industry data if you don't have a salary band. So the midpoint is 1. Anything under means that the employee is paid less percentage, X percentage less than the midpoint. And anything more means that the employee is paid X percent more than the midpoint. So let's look at a sample department. So this is a specific department that we're looking at. And in this department, we have 3 employees. We have an individual contributor 2, an IC 3, and a manager. And this is directly tied to someone's career pathing. So let's say for this instance, we have a specialist, a lead, and a director in terms of their titles. Here, you'll notice that 2 of them are under the midpoint, or under the point of 1, and 1 is above, but in the notes section, all of them are considered performing in their role. This is where your salary bands really tie into career pathing and potentially performance management, if that is your philosophy, because as people gain more skills and expertise, they can move up their ratio, and thus a formulaic way of moving up their band. So at Bright & Early, we have a few guidelines we like to use. To summarize our guidelines, people that are new to their role are learning, and thus should be at the start of their band, or starting point of their band. People who are performing in their role are essentially operating with minimal to no oversight, and they should be around the midpoint of the band because they're already kind of doing the role on hand. And people who are mastering their role or have mastered their role are towards the top end of their band, and they might be actually pushing into the next phase, or you're looking to promote them if they want. You can determine how you want your ratios to be represented at your company. These are our general guidelines, but for example, this depends on how you believe in pay. If you believe as pay for impact, this is going to change, because if you only believe in paying for top performance, your ratios might actually start a lot lower, and you might actually give raises based on a 1 ratio. At Bright & Early, we believe in making sure people are moving up the band aligned with market adjustments, as well as how they're gaining expertise and skills. So we want to make sure we are not only moving people up in their learning phases, but also in their mastering stage too, so that there's just that equitable progression and we're not essentially leaving anyone behind. One important thing to note, this is not applicable to unions. And when working with clients, this is the part where I see, you could say, the glimmer in people's eyes, because this is the point where people realize that compensation isn't all made up, and you can really build something equitable and keep on top of it, especially when you have your formulas like beautifully working. It is literally just one Excel sheet or Google sheet, and you change something and everything kind of just changes all at once, and you don't have to kind of go and manually input things and try to present that to your leadership team. It's just a document you can present, and that's why I love using these ratios for raises. Okay, so you've done all this great work. You've figured out the compa ratio. It works. All your leaders are bought in. Everything is magic. But the reality is that no matter how sound your bands are, no matter how great your philosophy is, no matter how beautiful your formula looks, there are overarching market dynamics at play. I've had clients, once again, who's had really the best intentions, but they weren't hitting numbers, unfortunately, and revenue was going down, and they couldn't afford to do market adjustments and do promotions or anything this year because of just the reality of their market. So that meant that they had to do hiring freezes and promotion freezes and freeze on market adjustments as well, because they had to survive as a business. This happens to the best of us. It's a business reality, but the most important piece, if this is happening, is to communicate it to your staff. I understand that there's a balancing act. Of course, you want to be transparent where possible, but you also don't want to ignite fear into your staff. But the thing is, pay directly impacts our livelihoods, and it's really important to communicate how you're diverging from your philosophy and why, and what the plan is to bring back stability. Because the thing is, people are smart and they're going to ask questions. And if your leadership is not aligned with the sound rationale of the plan of bringing it back, your people are going to start assuming and making their own stories. And that's where it becomes dangerous. And that's where you start losing trust and losing people off all the work that you've created. So it's important to communicate, even though there is a fine line of, not scaring or alarming. Okay, so moving on to market checks. In order to ensure that you're evolving with market, staying on top of it, we always recommend conducting those market checks. I recommend reviewing it at least semi-annually and keeping track of those changes. This doesn't mean doing adjustments every single time, just keeping track and seeing what's happening. Also, identify your threshold. So some companies decide to pay a cost of living adjustment. Some pay cost of labor, and some pay only for performance unless there's a significant change in the market. And this specific piece should align to your philosophy. Also, ensure that the changes are applied across the board versus individually. So once again, this connects back to your threshold, but say you're paying cost of living, and inflation, say, was called out at 8%, but you've only budgeted for 4%, you do 4% across the board because that's what you can afford. This is what we recommend doing at Bright+Early. It's the most equitable thing to do, but say you're doing cost of labor, you might adjust based on how much the job has changed in the market, which you can determine through the market checks that you've been keeping track of. Now, this amount varies between departments, so I recommend identifying additional parameters so that you aren't creating large inequities between your different departments. You want to make sure that even if there is a gap between departments, no one is being really, really left behind. There is some sort of consistency in your departments progressing forward. And then also, ensuring that you're making a sound business decision. So if you're noticing that there is a department getting, let's call it, left behind or under, ensure that there's a sound business decision around what will happen to the culture and the retention if this continues to happen. Let's do some real talk here. This happens in businesses all the time, but making sure that the leadership is aligned on what's going on and acknowledging that if this continues, if this is actually a business decision to continue doing this, what will this mean for the culture? What will it mean for retention? And making sure we're all kind of aligned on the outcome there. And then to keep on top of pay equity, it's important that no one gets left behind. So this means to include your individuals who are on leave, whether it's leave of absence or parental leave, and make sure those market reviews and adjustment cycles apply to them as well as those transitioning back into work. Alrighty, so compa ratio, my favorite thing. It could not only be used to bring people into the band, but it could also support you in market adjustments. So in this example, we have someone at the $70,000 mark, and we've decided to adjust their band by 4%. To do this, you apply the 4% to your existing bands, so your bands today, and that will populate your new bands for your, let's say, your 2024 bands. So now your bands have been aged 4% for next year. To determine where someone should be in that new band, you take their current compa ratio, so in this case, it's 0.92, and use that, multiply that by the midpoint of the new band. So in 2024, this individual will now be bumped up to $72,800. So instead of kind of doing 4% across the board, everyone gets 4%. That's not necessarily how it works. It's more so making sure that people are adjusted based on their compa ratio. So for some, it might mean they actually get a 2% increase. For others, it might mean they get the 4% increase. It really depends on where they are in their band, but this provides you a really formulaic way of giving changes across the board without kind of applying it with essentially no formula and kind of like haphazardly doing it. So this is just a super formulaic way of doing adjustments across the board, and that's why I love it. And the steps are here in case you wanted to screenshot or take this back. But essentially, to wrap up, I love that we have time for questions. I'm excited. To tie it all together, building on salary bands is not only the equitable thing to do, but it's a strategic thing to do. I know, once again, it seems super daunting, but once you have your foundation in place and a sound philosophy that aligns with it, it does get a lot easier. And our work at Bright and Early is to support teams in developing their reward strategy. Our main goal is to build something with you to support your scale. It's really, really important to us that you can continue the work after we offboard. So we really double down on employee education and training, not only as you, as practitioners, but also with your employees, so that we're leaving everyone with an understanding of the comp work and everything that's gone into it, so that you can maintain it and evolve it for years to come. So with that said, let's go into Q&A.
Beautiful. So right now we have over 10 questions. I'm going to try to group them similarly, Trisha, so it's, you know, a little bit easier for you to give your thoughts. So we'll jump in. We have a little bit over 10 questions, so I want to make sure that we have time for all of those. So starting at the philosophical level, question reads, do you find organizations have different philosophies at different levels within the organization?
Oh, interesting. So say someone is a coordinator, they have a different philosophy than perhaps a VP or an exec.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I would say no. So usually the work that we build, the philosophy is applied to all, regardless of role, level, position. And the way that I see it, or we at Bright and Early see it, is that your philosophy is your guiding, I was going to say guiding star or North Star, but essentially your North Star, your guidance in terms of making any sort of compensation decision. So it should be general enough. For example, if you do market adjustments are applied to all. If you do merit increases, it's applied to all. So you want your philosophy to encompass all of that. Same with your benefits and perks, making sure that it's applied to all. I understand that there are tiered benefits in case you are an executive, but in general, this is your philosophy and approach to pay. So I wouldn't actually separate it out per level.
I absolutely agree. Again, the philosophy is meant to be very overarching across the entire organization. So I agree with everything that you've said as well, and would echo the same. So the next question around determining compensation philosophy, how do you determine that philosophy? Performance versus market versus cost of living?
Yeah, exactly. Great question. When I help my clients determine philosophy, I roll up with some very meta questions. My clients often tell me that the questions I ask are more intense than what their board asks. And it's because I want to understand philosophically what you believe in. How do you think about pay? What did you learn growing up? It's something that I think is actually really important to understand the psychology behind pay and how your leaders think about pay, because then you are able to design a philosophy that they're not only bought into, but they can believe and champion. So in terms of how do you get to the bottom of knowing if you're doing market adjustments or merit or cost of living, that comes down to how your leaders are psychologically understanding pay. Do they believe in merit increases, or market increases, even if someone may not be performing? For some, that's going to be a no. For others, that's going to be a yes. So it's not necessarily on me to tell them right or wrong, but it's making sure that we're guiding them based on their overarching principles. So for example, if a company really believes and has a strong D&I, diversity, equity, inclusion strategy, perhaps we actually move a little away from performance. Perhaps we actually advocate for market-based adjustments applicable to all that are happening every single year, guaranteed regardless of performance, because that is the equitable thing to do. And that champions your DEI goals. So that's kind of how I help companies craft their philosophy.
Now, this question doesn't connect to the philosophy piece, but it kind of is all grouped together. So they're saying that the conversation is based on performing in the role and predominantly on salary. So what about other benefits connecting to your philosophy? For example, this participant says they provide gym usage during work hours, etc. So Trisha, that would be something that, again, is a business decision to anchor your total compensation, salary, if you have bonus, if you have equity, if you have different perks like gym usage. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. So looking at everything from a total package perspective, like your base salary might fluctuate depending on your business reality, right? Maybe at one point you can pay top dollar and maybe you actually can't. But your total comp is going to allow to incentivize people beyond just salary. You want to start intrinsically motivating your people.
Okay, I have about 7 or 8 questions that are all related very tactically about salary bands, and I think that they're pretty juicy. So starting at the top, very curious to know your thoughts on whether or not salary bands need to overlap between levels.
Oh, my favorite question. If you ask Trisha's personal opinion is yes. I believe this because when you overlap your salary bands, you account for the nuances between, for example, ICs and people managers. There's a lot of things that happen essentially when you're kind of moving from an IC into a people manager role, or even leveling up in your skill set as an IC, or also known as individual contributor. And when you overlap your bands, you account for that flexibility. And I can't quite call out the nuances that might happen. Like you could, for example, have a junior manager that is not quite ready to get leveled up, but they have that potential and they're hitting all their elements that they need to hit, but they just need a little bit more experience. Maybe they need one more person under their belt to manage and mentor before they can officially get promoted into a manager. But that overlap will allow them to get that bump of that recognition before they hit the next level. So you don't have to promote someone right away. The overlaps allow you to still progress someone without promoting them. My issue with what I call step bands, so bands that don't overlap, is that first, it's extremely expensive for a company to do that, meaning that anytime you have to promote someone, it's usually a pretty big jump, especially in the more senior levels. That jump could look like $80,000 in some cases, depending on your market data. Whereas the overlap also allows you to have more flexibility in your budget as well. So you can actually, from a company perspective, perhaps give a smaller raise because that's what your budget permits, but you're still moving them up into the next level, so it's still equitable.
Okay, so the long short is yes. You called something out, and I know I'm going to send us on a rabbit hole if we talk about this, but if anyone is interested on a unique philosophy on compensation changes between individual contributor and people managers, Shopify has published a very, very interesting article on their philosophy, how that's changed over the pandemic. And I really encourage folks to read that just as an additional resource. Okay. So Trisha, how do you compare roles that require a high level of technical skills, for example, an engineer, versus non-technical roles, for example, customer support? Do you have separate bands? Yes or no?
Yes. So yeah, your bands should be specific to departments unless your job families are the same. So to provide a picture, at Bright+Early, most of the employees on the team are HR people. So our bands are actually just HR. We use a blended approach where we collect our data from HR and consultancies, but it's HR. And then we do have an ops manager. So our ops manager, they're not an HR practitioner, so they actually do have a separate band for themselves. And that's how we run it.
Perfect. So yes, you need to have different bands across different departments. That's very important. Okay. So should these compensation bands be done for each region that you're hiring for example, Canada versus the US or Toronto versus Winnipeg?
Ooh, okay. This is a philosophical question.
Yeah.
Yes. Do you believe in location-based pay, or do you believe in agnostic pay? You're touching into a conversation that could be its own webinar. I would say that if you are in Canada, I believe in a national pay approach. So paying across Canada, just because at this point, especially with remote work, people can kind of go anywhere, especially across Canada. And in terms of trends, what we're seeing with client work in terms of equity, we are noticing a Canada-wide approach. Now, if you have different regions, so you're operating out of Canada and the US, you might decide to take a national approach. So Canada-specific salaries, US-specific salaries. We have seen, if you are US based, honestly, US currency is better. So as a competitive advantage, US companies might actually say, we're going to pay the equivalent salaries to Canadians, but in Canadian dollars. So say US salary is $100,000 USD, the Canadian equivalent will get $100,000 Canadian. That's a philosophy that they've stood with. And that's something that you'll need to determine for your organization as well.
Okay. Perfect. 5 minutes left. 7 questions, some of them around compliance. So I'm just going to rapid fire and we're going to get through what we can. Does the salary band only apply to base salary? What about roles where there's base salary plus commission?
For this presentation, the salary bands apply to base salaries. You can have a commission structure based on your level of seniority.
Mm-hmm. Now, the next question, how do you incorporate relevant or irrelevant qualifications such as a master's degree or designations? For example, someone who might be working in an operations role who holds an HR designation. Should they be compensated differently?
Depends on your philosophy. I would say that what matters most is what they're doing in the role and what they need to do for that role. So if that person happens to have a designation, great. Do I need to compensate for that? If it's not applicable to my role, then technically no. But for example, in finance, I do need my CFA, for example. So perhaps that might be compensated. So this just depends on the role at hand and what you need from that.
Again, folks, if the role has a bona fide occupational requirement, a lawyer with a law degree, a finance professional with a CFA or CPA, again, that is something that I would also recommend including in some of the details, maybe some FAQs, not necessarily your philosophy.
Yeah.
So related to that, any examples of other factors beyond experience that would affect someone's placement in a band, where maybe they have less experience than someone that is typical for this role, but have moved into a role out of need, roles to the occasion now have a lot of accountability? Any best practices for weighing those factors against experience?
That's a really great question. I would look at how the person is actually operating in that role. So regardless of their background or previous experience, if they are operating at the level you need them to operate, so they're doing the role at hand, they should be in that respective salary band. So let's say I don't have an ops background, but I am operating as an intermediate ops person, I should be paid at that intermediate level. Short answer.
Okay. This one's interesting. Thoughts on eliminating the ceiling, so the cap on bands, and just keeping it as the floor for salary bands?
That makes me nervous because that could quickly become a pay inequity battle. Depends on your negotiation stance. So if you allow for negotiation, there are certain people that are going to push past well beyond other people. And when you don't have a cap, you lose creating an equilibrium for salaries. You eventually want to get to a place where your junior salaries and your executive salaries isn't as much of a gap. There will be, but you're hopefully trying to create an equilibrium. And when you have uncapped salaries, that becomes infinite. So that makes me nervous.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. The next question is around financial planning. So you talked about benchmarking for financial planning, wondering how to figure out what the best industry practice is for the percentage of what you mentioned I think Trisha as an example for COLA, for the percentage that they should be doing. This company is coming up to their year end and they don't have a process. So they're curious if there's an industry benchmark there.
Yeah, this depends on if you're doing cost of living versus cost of labor. If you're doing cost of living, I would look at the inflation of the year end, and then based on what you can afford. So for example, I believe last year's year end was like 8% or 9%. I did not recommend companies to do that, but some companies could afford 4% and some companies could do 3%. And this year, again, we're seeing 3 to 4%. In terms of best practice, our clients are doing 4%.
Okay. And how do you give a 4% COLA, cost of living adjustment, for people who are already redlined? Do you?
I would say so, yes, because that's regardless. The market is adjusting their salary. It's nothing to do with their performance or merit.
Okay. With remote work on the rise, Trisha, someone wants to confirm the statement around compliance with Ontario pay transparency. Does this apply to remote workers located in Ontario when the company is headquartered in another province, for example, Alberta, or only in the business, or only where the business is physically located in Ontario? So pay transparency, where does it apply?
So Ontario doesn't have legislation around pay transparency. Ontario does have pay equity. If you are operating within a specific province, I believe you have to comply. I would like to get back to you just to confirm with our compliance expert, but I believe that is it, at least across.
Okay. The last question that I will ask, and then we will do a quick wrap up. How do you explain the differences in salary bands to the workforce? So tying that back to the communication piece. What is your best piece of advice you can give to folks who are communicating salary bands?
Okay, best piece of advice is to walk them through the process you took when determining your salary band. So how did you do the market reviews? What are the questions that you asked? How did you come up with your determining factors? What does a market even look like? Why are there differences? And you as a company, why did you take a specific stance to separate it out? And once you provide them that context or foundational element of why there's a market difference, then you can say, okay, this is your market versus this market. These are why your salaries look different, and this is how we've placed you in your band. So as much context as possible around how you've built your band to help kind of support your business decisions.
Wonderful. Trisha, we are at time. I know you had mentioned some resources, so I think the folks will be sharing in the chat some of the linked resources, the ebook that you had mentioned with Bright+Early. I really just want to thank everybody who participated for the engaging and incredible questions. Trisha, it's honestly been such a pleasure to connect with you. I think at the end of our presentation, which we will be sharing, folks will have access to the slides. We also had a section where folks can directly connect with you on LinkedIn, myself on LinkedIn, Bright+Early. And again, really want to thank everybody and the folks at Bright+Early and you specifically, Trisha, for allowing us the opportunity to learn from you today.
Awesome. Thank you again. Thanks for everyone for joining.
Wonderful. Okay, we will sign off. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your Wednesday. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.